Welcome to the Bankers Lebanese Leadership Series. This is the first to be filmed in the Middle East, so we're very pleased to welcome you here today in Beirut. And I'd like to introduce you to all the speakers today. If we go around and just introduce ourselves, and then we'll start some questions. Stephen Timewell, Editor Emeritus of The Banker.
Sami Haddad, Executive Director, B+ Bank.
Saad Azhari, Chairman, General Manager of Blum Bank.
Freddy Baz, Group CFO and the Strategy Director of Bank Audi.
Makram Sadr, Secretary General of the Lebanese Banks Association in Lebanon.
Well, we're very pleased to have you here today. Life is changing, particularly in the Middle East, and I want to mention when I was here in March, we wrote a story on Lebanon, a few stories on Lebanon for the May issue, and things have changed a bit since then. What we're doing today is to look at going forward, what's changed, what's happening in the rest of 2011, and then perhaps we'll look forward to 2012. But first, I think the first core question is to look at the basic macro and political situation in the region. And clearly there's a lot happening in the region, and what I want to address initially from all of you is how do you see the growth for the rest of 2011? And clearly we've had a new government in Lebanon from the middle of June, and try and give some perspective for our readers and viewers around the world of what is the impact of both the macro and the political developments that have taken place in recent months. I just want to mention some of the figures that I've got in front of me from the IIF in Washington, that the Institute of Finance has revised downward the GDP and forecast for Lebanon from 4% last January to between 1.1% and 3% for 2011. These are interesting developments, and I'm sure you all have views and comments on this, and I think it's very interesting to be able to have you here today and to have your comments on how the developments in whether it be Egypt, Syria, or wherever is impacting on Lebanon and on the economy. So that's the first core question, and I'd like a response from everybody, and I'll start with Makram, a first initial response, and then we'll have a bit of interaction.
Thank you. We don't have until now a unified opinion about the rate of growth of the Lebanese economy in 2011. As you mentioned, IIF has a figure 1.1 to 3. The IMF is speaking about less than 2% now. A few months ago, their position was about 2.5%. Today, maybe it is less than 2%, but definitely it will be a growth less than, too much less than last year or the last 4 years. Still, I think myself, we have two driving force behind the Lebanese, the economic growth in Lebanon. The one is we have a good news from the one side, the oil prices, and because we are too much related to a lot of financial flows from the Gulf countries, GCC countries, not just in terms of FDI, but in terms of tourism, in terms of transfers from our labor force working in the GCC countries, the FDI, etc. So we are related to the GCC economies, and we are expecting this flow to continue, maybe at a slower path, but it will. This flow will continue. The other component of the growth, the other driver of the growth in the country is the bank credit. And for sure, we have a moderate bank credit compared to the last year. We are around 6% for the first 5 months. It means we will have maybe around 12% for this year the growth in the lending to the economy, to the private economy in Lebanon. And I think it's a good lending growth. So the sum of these two driving the external one and the internal will have good impact on the economic growth.
Good, good, interesting. Fair.
Yeah, I believe that it's still too early, honestly, to give an opinion. Because as Makram mentioned, we only have the indicators for the first 4 months of the year. And so far, those indicators shows mixed signals. If we look at the real sector indicators, among them more principally delivery of cement, electricity production, velocity of money, ships at the port, planes at the airport, they all show decreases with respect to the corresponding period of last year, which confirm some kind of a deceleration in growth rates in Lebanon. But we have to keep in mind that seasonal factors are important in Lebanon. And normally the contribution of the second half of the year has always been more important than the first half of the year. But as Makram said it also, because we have the same reading, of the situation, we are still seeing some kind of a disconnection, I would say, between the monetary sector and the real sector. Lebanon imports for the first 5 months reached $7.3 billion. It's a very important measure for domestic consumption and to a lesser extent domestic investment, which still represent 70% of the growth drivers in Lebanon. And more importantly, those imports which have generated a deficit, a trade deficit by $6 billion, translating into a deficit in our balance of payment of $1 billion only, highlight that the income account, the services account, and the capital account have still showed a surplus by $5 billion in the first 5 months of 2011, which correspond to $1 billion per month, and those are what we call inflows in Lebanon. So although inflows have decreased with respect to 2010, but they are still sustained to the extent possible to ensure the required growth in the deposit base in local banks, which within the context of their high financial flexibility as measured by an average Basel II ratio of 12.5%, allowed them to launch new waves of loans to the domestic private sector. Once again, the most important driver for GDP growth in Lebanon, by 13.5% on an annualized basis. And we all know that there is a corollary between nominal growth in domestic lending and nominal growth in GDP. So if you assume that lending to the domestic private sector will reach 12, 13, 14%, so depending on our view of the deflator for 2011, it means that there is still a room for a comfortable growth in the domestic economy within a range of 2.5 to 4%, let's say. But once again, it's still too early. We have to wait a few months more in order to be able to give a more fine-tuned opinion.
Thank you, Freddie. Too early to tell. As I think one of the Chinese leaders said about the French Revolution. But there we go. Right, Saad.
Overall, maybe to summarize, the banking system is doing pretty well. We have seen growth of total assets about 4 to 5% since the first 5 months of this year. Deposit also grew about 4% from the beginning of the year. Lending to the private sector, if you only take the private sector lending, there was a growth for the first 5 months of 7.2% from the beginning of the year. Sorry, 7.2%. If you take year on year, like 19% growth. So the banks are doing well. They are providing loans. The size of the banks and the deposit size in the banking sector is very high. So we are able to continue to provide funding to the private and public sector. And this is driving growth in Lebanon. There is definitely a political uncertainty that we have seen in the last 6-7 months, and political tension regionally and in Lebanon that is affecting the growth, because affecting the confidence and affecting the growth. It's also too early to say how things are going to develop. There's a new government now, and today they will start in the parliament to approve the new government in the parliament. So we are, in a transitory period, and we have to wait and see, the measures that the government is going to take, how the opposition and the Arab countries and the international community are going to be dealing with the new government. So this is something that we have to wait and see how things develop in the region and in Lebanon. But I would reconfirm that really all indicators tell us that the growth this year is going to be less than last year, and probably between 2 to 4%.
Right, thank you, Saad.
Well, my colleague said it all, but to summarize, there is no question that this year's growth will be significantly lower than last year. Whether we're still waiting or the second quarter or the second half, it will be significantly lower. And with the tensions, political and security tensions around us, and the extreme political tension that's affecting the political life in Lebanon, it's bound to have a negative impact on confidence and on economic activity.
Right. I think this opens the view to, as an outsider, one sees a lot of issues in Syria and Egypt, and these are important countries for Lebanon. For the outsider, it's hard to gauge the importance of what's happening in Syria and how long that will last, and what long-term impact that will have on Lebanon. Can you sort of expand on that to some extent? Whoever would like to
Look,
respond.
there is no question that in the short term, what's happening in Syria and Egypt is affecting these economies negatively. And many Lebanese banks are present in Syria, significantly so, and the 2 largest Lebanese banks are also present in Egypt. So the impact is negative. Now, how will it affect the banks? The banks in Lebanon are very well capitalized, they're very liquid. And these investments that we all made in Syria and Egypt are for the long term. We're not, short-term players. So whatever shocks will be easily absorbed given the level of capital adequacy and liquidity. But how soon the turmoil in Syria and Egypt will end and what will the outcome be, I think it's too early to tell. But you mentioned the French Revolution at the beginning. The French Revolution, did away with the monarchy and replaced it by an emperor. So we don't know.
Indeed, the French Revolution may be our guide. Very.
We do look to those political transitions or changes in the countries you have named, Stephen, as being obviously positive, because more freedom and democracy can only but improve political governance in any country, and by extension the efficiency of the economy. And as long as our presence in those countries is a long-term presence we are building, for the future, we are not driven by short-term considerations. We are not driven by our bottom lines, in those countries. We are much more driven by our capacity to build a strong franchise over years. Although we are committed towards our shareholders to deliver profitability, obviously, what we have been doing starting year one in all those countries where we have expanded over the last few years. But having said that, it's amazing the level of resilience we have shown as Lebanese banks in those markets. If I have to take Egypt, because Egypt, the outburst was early February, and now we have the luxury of statistical experience. We are almost, we are in July, so we have a track record of history. There haven't been any single downgrade to NPL of our corporate clients. And we took also very prudent decisions, like allocating a major part of our pre-tax profits as collective provisioning. Today, early July, I can tell you very comfortably that most of those collective provisions taken in Egypt over the last 4 or 5 months look much more today as delayed profits for us than definitive, real provisions. Syria, it's a different context, because Syria, we are still, in the middle, of the problem. Prospects are not very clear, so we have to be probably cautious in making similar statements. But so far, either in the corporate loan portfolio or in the retail loan portfolio, we haven't witnessed major delays highlighting possible, plausible, hypothetical impairments or delinquencies. But so far, what we have witnessed shows that we are almost in a similar situation than in Egypt in terms of the resilience of our risk profiles, facing those important political challenges in Syria.
Would you agree, sir?
The effect of Syria, Egypt, is really on the Lebanese banks is more, I would say, that the growth, that our growth is not going to be as strong as the years before because of the events, because the economic situation, due to this period of instability, affected the economic growth in those countries, and our growth is not going to be any significant growth in those markets. So this is, we had expectation of high growth. Now it's a period where I think more stability in those countries. But because of our conservative, strategy, the Lebanese bank's conservative strategy in those countries, and high liquidity and really strong, I would say, loan portfolio, I think that we are not witnessing any real problems or any increase of non-performing loans. So really the impact is minimal, and and I think for the prospects for the future in the Arab world, I would say in general, because there is a movement now happening country after country in different countries in the Arab world, but the tendency is to have more open systems, and really, and this is positive for the long term, for the economic growth in the Arab world. And we are not really, pessimistic. It's the opposite. But for the long term, short term, we are witnessing in some countries some effect on the economy, and I think maybe other countries are going to follow. I mean, this movement could follow in different countries in the Arab world. But we are, like Mr. Haddad said, we are in those countries for the long term, and that's why we are not worried.
Does this mean, in a sense, we can look positively for the Lebanese banks? The foreign banks often pull out when the going gets heavy, but you guys are in there for the long term. And is this a good positive development for Lebanese banks? In a certain sense, you take the best out of a bad situation. Is it possible to say that the Lebanese banks, in terms of compared to foreign banks, will gain out of this Arab Spring, if you like?
I mean, we made these strategic investments, whether it's in Syria or for others in Egypt and other countries of the region. And obviously, in the short term, we will suffer, but I mean, we will absorb whatever we need to absorb easily. Growth will slow down in these countries. Our profitability is likely to slow down. But we're in it for the long term, and we will reap significant profits, both because with the new wave of more openness, hopefully economic liberalism, but we still have to see, the result should be faster growth, more open economies, which will benefit, obviously, the people living in these countries and will benefit us as in our activities.